Muy buenas tardes a todos. Hoy tenemos una invitada muy especial, la profesora Mariana Mazzucato, una de las pensadoras más influyentes en temas de innovación y política económica a nivel mundial. Mariana es profesora del University College London y directora fundadora del Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose de la misma universidad. Su trabajo ha redefinido cómo entendemos el papel del gobierno y el mercado para impulsar el crecimiento y la innovación. Seguramente ustedes conocen a Mazzucato por sus libros más vendidos, El Estado Emprendedor, Misión Economía y su más reciente obra, El Gran Engaño. Sus ideas no solo están transformando los debates académicos, sino que también están influyendo en gobiernos y formuladores de política pública alrededor del mundo. Hoy vamos a profundizar en esas ideas, explorando cómo pueden ayudarnos en México a superar algunos de nuestros principales desafíos en materia de desigualdad y hasta en materia de cambio climático. Así que quédense con nosotros porque esta será una conversación que no se pueden perder. Let me start by the basics. So you talk about a special kind of government, one government that should not only do kind of like fixing market failures, but more like shaping the market and having special missions. Could you explain us the difference between these two forms of government?
Sure. So I'm an economist, and economic theory has convinced us, it's almost a story we told, and then there's a theory and mathematical formulas behind it, that at best what the state should do is to fix market failures. And I believe that that is part of the problem. That means that we haven't been able to actually address the challenges we have, whether they be the ones around climate change, water, inequality. If you're always fixing a market failure, it's always too little, too late. And also, it's a negative mode. You're filling the gap. For example, there might be a financial gap around a particular problem. As opposed to what? As opposed to actually actively, proactively shaping the market to deliver on what a society thinks is important. So if you have a leader that talks about inclusive and sustainable growth, what does that actually mean for public-private collaborations? What does it mean for how a government uses the power of procurement, las compras públicas, no? To actually deliver solutions for big problems? So it's a change not only in the theory, but also in the mindset, in the narrative. I sometimes joke that I come in as an economist and I come out as a life coach, a therapist, because you need much more confidence. But it doesn't mean a big state. It's not about big or small, it's strategic. It's a state that actually tries to deliver on outcomes, not outputs, but outcomes. And that might be, you know, to solve big problems that we have around net zero, around health for all issues, around water. It doesn't make sense to just see these problems at a sectoral level. You need to define the problem and then get an economy-wide interaction to solve it.
Right. When you talk in your research about the tools that we need to have in order to solve these problems, you talk about state-owned companies, you talk also about contrataciones públicas, and you talk about basically a set of tools that require resources.
Yeah.
That's a big problem for a country like Mexico, where we collect very few taxes. Mexico collects about 16 points of GDP per year. So that's about half what they collect on the OCDE.
Yeah.
So do you think that a prerequisite for implementing a mission-oriented state is to have a fiscal reform?
Well, absolutely. I mean, if you don't have funds, if you have a very weak fiscal space, it's very hard to do anything, whether it's to fund properly public education, public health, or these very difficult, complex problems that we have, which have innovation and knowledge creation at the center. But we should ask ourselves also why we have that limited fiscal space. There's also global issues. We've had financial institutions, for example, in the Bretton Woods system, that when providing loans to developing countries actually created conditionality that was based on austerity, on deficit reduction, forgetting that actually we need public investment in order to drive productivity and the productive capacity of an economy, which is the denominator of debt to GDP. So there's been a problem with these financial institutions. There's a massive problem around tax evasion and tax avoidance and rent seeking in a country like Mexico, but also in my country, Italy. So don't feel lonely. So definitely without, you know, a tax intake, but also the wrong taxes. This is not about increasing taxes on the poor. We need wealth taxes, we need a capital gains tax, and by the way, the structure of those taxes is what matters. Most problems require long-term patient finance. So if we have a tax system that rewards short-term, like almost millisecond trades, you're not going to get that long-term finance. So the issue with capital gains, for example, is not just the rate, it's the term structure. What you want to do is, for example, reduce capital gains tax for long-term investments, not for short-term investments.
We have a country that has very high profits for the private sector, and at the same time, still very low wages and very low rates of taxation. However, when any government has tried to change these regulations, they had been told that if they do that, then investment is going to fly out of the country and we're going to lose those businesses. What would you say about that argument?
So that's based on many different factors, of which the first is ideology, right? But also there's no evidence that that's true. So it's also based on certain incumbents which are making money through the current status quo, who then use threats, one could even call it bullying, to a government that if there's any change that would actually, in many cases, help distribute wealth more equitably, more fairly, based on the just contributions, for example, of labor, which continues to have a low share of global income, let alone in Mexico, which is also more unequal than many countries, then this kind of threat. I often say, if they threaten to leave, buy them an Uber, get them out. But obviously that's facetious. That's not going to work either. What you want is to attract the kind of capital, the kind of business that sticks. Any business that says it's going to come here because of low tax, as soon as another country provides a better tax regime, they're out. So that's not going to give you a long-term competitiveness. What you want are those good small, medium, large enterprises that can work in, for example, the so-called polos de bienestar, or whatever a government might be thinking about in terms of creating an innovative hub and clusters around the circular economy or around particular types of challenges which require, again, new forms of knowledge creation, new forms of relationship with local universities.
Mariana, talking about this idea of constructing capacity within the state, for many years, Mexico was ruled by a political class that said that the best industrial policy is to have no industrial policy. Then you come as an economist and you actually say, yes, we have to have industrial policy. However, a very specific kind of industrial policy that you call it with conditionalities. Could you explain us the type of conditionalities that you are thinking and how this idea of industrial policy is different from the previous idea of industrial policy in the 70s?
Sure. So first of all, when someone says they don't want an industrial policy, that's already an industrial policy. That means that you're going to start featuring, for example, deregulation, corporate welfare. That is an industrial policy. It's just a stupid industrial policy. But we shouldn't pretend that's not a policy, right? There is no lack of policy. There's all sorts of things governments do, including reducing tax. That's a policy, right? So the question is, what are we even trying to do? And so the 1970s industrial policy, I think, has received some fair critiques and some unfair critiques. I think the right critique is that if you have a government that just makes a list of sectors that they deem to be the most important, top sectors, key sectors, as opposed to having really important problems that the government and the society is facing, which require all sectors to transform and to innovate towards, then we have a problem. So I believe in the latter. I believe that we should have a challenge/mission-oriented industrial policy, thinking of problems whether they be around clean growth, clean water and water for all, healthy aging, reducing the digital divide. These are problems. And then the question is, backtrack, what does it mean for the different types of sectors? If we have a clean growth strategy, that's not just about renewable energy. That's also about data and AI, of course. It's also about thinking how we move, how we eat, how we build. Cement and steel are important for building. If we have a clean growth strategy, that will have implications for those sectors. And conditionality is a consequence of that. I don't begin with conditionality. I begin with missions and challenges and say, don't choose the sectors, choose the challenges, and ask what it means for different sectors. Now, an example of conditionality would be if you look at Germany, which has been very ambitious around their Energiewende policy to reduce their carbon emissions. That has meant that their public bank, called the KfW, would provide loans to some sectors that were in trouble, like the steel sector, which globally is in trouble and begging for handouts. In Germany, because they had a clear strategy, those loans from the public bank were conditional that the sector lower the material content of production. How they did it was up to them. If you micromanage industry, you kill entrepreneurship, you kill innovation. That's not what we want. You want a clear direction from the state, leaving open the how. And they did apply repurpose, reuse, recycle technology throughout the whole production chain of steel manufacturing. And today, Germany has the greenest steel, which is a form of competitiveness, because of course the world is being asked to move towards, net zero, even finance.
In a country like Mexico, there is a very special problem because we have a lot of monopolies and we have a lot of companies that have market power.
Yes.
So sometimes when the government has to find its partners, they have to work with the same people of always, the same monopolist of always, and then that further empowers this monopolistic economy. So how can we develop a new, let's say, layer of entrepreneurs or of business that can actually compete with the big business of always?
Yes, it's a very important question, and that's why we need industrial strategy and competition policy going hand in hand. If you have a monopolistic, rent-seeking economy, and I would argue, Mexico could be characterized as having, lots of monopolies and lots of rent-seeking. But again, you're not the only ones. There's many economies out there that have similar challenges. Then it's very important to use these missions precisely in order to galvanize real investment and not just profits that are about just trading existing assets or based on inertia, just because of a corrupt relationship, for example, with the government, a local government, a regional government, or a national government. And again, I'm speaking here more generally. You can tell me the degree to which you think this applies to Mexico. But let me give you an example. I mentioned the moon landing. Let me normalize this. Think of school meals, no? School lunch. Las comidas en las escuelas públicas. Now, so important. It's often the only food that poor children eat. So that can be seen as a welfare policy. But you can turn it into an innovation policy if we're ambitious on that school meal. So let's say you have a corrupt procurement process or an incumbents that are just used to getting the contract from the government to create not very good meals because it's just lunch. Reagan once said that ketchup was a vegetable. They say school meals have to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. They need to invest, right? So creating innovation characteristics around important public problems, whether it's the school meals, whether it's sustainable mobility, whether it's an urban mobility system and your circular economy in a city, if it requires investment, innovation, and training, that's the best way to start to reduce the monopolistic power. Why? Because the monopolies are happy with the status quo. They don't want change. They have been used to receiving benefits for doing nothing, for sitting in place. And by the way, Adam Smith, which many people who've never read him think that he was anti-state. It's not true. The free market for Adam Smith was free from rent.
Thank you so much, Professor Mazzucato, for this conversation. It was great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Y muchas gracias a ustedes por habernos acompañado este día.